Welcome, everyone, to today's webcast, How Penetration Testing Reduces Risk. I'm your host, Paul Asadoorian, joined by Mr. Matt Alderman in his Hawaiian shirt. Matt, welcome.
Good morning. Aloha, Paul.
Very nice. Very nice. I like it. This webcast is sponsored by CoreSecurity, a HelpSystems company. And with me today is Bob Erdman. He's the Senior Manager of Product Management. Bob, welcome.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
And James Adams, a sales engineer for CoreSecurity. James, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
As always, the slides and the video for this webcast will be available to all of those who registered, so you can check that out. An email will go out shortly after this broadcast with links to both. So the agenda for today, this webcast largely is about assessing the risk level of various vulnerabilities, verifying them with penetration testing. The first part will be kind of a little demo that I put together, a mock environment, where I wanted to look at specific vulnerabilities that I thought you could easily misinterpret the impact of those vulnerabilities. So that is going to be a lot of fun. The folks from Core will go over combining some vulnerabilities to compromise a domain along with a Core impact demo. So let's jump right into it. My slides should go pretty quick. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. You can review them afterwards to get some of the more technical details. But I created a mock environment that I wanted to attack. Now, I chose some really vulnerable software. I chose WordPress, which plugins have a lot of vulnerabilities, so many that I could put together really any sort of narrative I wanted to be able to demonstrate various vulnerabilities. We also have a MySQL server that's part of the WordPress environment. And you could have other Linux containers just as an example, right? So I've got all of this software running inside of containers, WordPress, a database, and two additional or more other containers running in my environment on top of Docker, which sits on top of a Linux host and kernel. So that's the environment. And the goal for this test was, well, really twofold, right? Was to use vulnerabilities that could be misunderstood as to their impact, but also compromise the entire environment. So compromise every application, every container, and break out of the Docker container onto the host. Now, that slide, I'll cover some techniques to do that. But the goal is to essentially get the configurations for the web applications, the database, get Shell on all of those systems so that we have the opportunity to break out of our Docker containers. So we start with just a WordPress site. Why would you want a WordPress site? There's actually lots of reasons. We actually use WordPress here at Security Weekly. Many places use WordPress because it's really easy to use and it has a ton of features. It is one of the most robust CMSs and website technologies on the market today because there's just so much functionality. A lot of marketing teams use it. In fact, way back in the day in the pen test, I exploited WordPress that was stood up by the marketing team, and no one had any idea that they had stood up a WordPress server. So you may find it in your environment if you go digging. Therefore, it becomes a very rich platform and popular platform, but also a very vulnerable one, as it's based on PHP, and there are tons and tons of plugins with tons and tons of vulnerabilities that are not often written by commercial companies. They could be written by other folks that may abandon the project, may not get assigned a CVE number. So those are some of the reasons why I chose WordPress as a target for this exercise. So I'm using the WP scan to simulate a vulnerability scan, right? You can discover vulnerabilities in a number of different ways. You can use the major vendors in vulnerability scanning. Core Impact itself will identify vulnerabilities, right, as part of its functionality. Then there are targeted vulnerability scanners, such as the one I'm using here, called WP Scan. WP Scan is super easy to run. It actually runs inside of a Docker container. So I can issue one command. It will pull down the container image. It will run WP Scan. I can pass it a command line parameter and give it the URL of the site that I want to target. So I spun up a test environment. I'll get into more of that kind of at the end. So I spun up a test environment. I scanned it with WP Scan, and I came across this plugin that I thought was interesting, JSMOL2 WordPress, which is a WordPress plugin which implements some shortcodes that are specific to, I think, defining molecules was this project actually, which was kind of interesting. So you can see it did say that this particular plugin is 1.07 and it's up to date. So you may look at these vulnerability scan results and go, oh, like, I'm good, right? And I was like, no, I want to dig deeper. And here we're going to talk about a server-side request forgery vulnerability that exists in this particular plugin, even though it told me this plugin was up to date.
2018 is up to date, Paul. I mean, come on.
Right. If I can get to the next slide. There we go. So there's a CVE associated with this particular vulnerability. It's 2018-20463. Now, what's interesting is it says that there's an arbitrary file upload vulnerability, but it also says that the way you access this vulnerability is to actually use the PHP filter resource identifier, which is an internal URL to a PHP application, right? So it's basically like a URL that is only accessible internally to the PHP application. It starts with PHP:// You can read the PHP documentation about it. So when it says that it can also be used for SSRF, that basically means that as an attacker, I can make the web application access some type of URL, right? Now, that can be internal, such as PHP://, right? Or it could be external, as in I can get it to visit an HTTP site. This most prime example of this was, I believe, the Equifax breach, right? Where they accessed an SSRF vulnerability to access an internal resource that leaked keys from AWS and access from AWS. Now, this particular vulnerability got a base CVSS score in the version 3 of CVSS of 7.5. Now, you may have a policy that says, well, we only patch CVSS 7.9 and below, like when we have time, right? So if it's 7.0 or 8.0 or higher, then we're going to apply an immediate patch. And the patch cycle is going to be much shorter. If it's below that, well, maybe we don't, right? So this sits at a 7.5. And
that is because I think most organizations struggle, Paul, with patching and prioritizing. So they focus on a subset of vulnerabilities. 8, 9s, and 10s seem critical or have a high impact. Therefore, they focus there and maybe not on something lower than that.
Right. What's interesting about this vulnerability is the vulnerability scanner said it was up to date. There was, in fact, a CVE associated with it. However, on the website wpvulns.com, I believe, it says this plugin is no longer in development. In fact, this plugin hasn't been updated in a number of years, and this project has been abandoned, which is some of my concerns with identifying vulnerabilities. How do we know something's vulnerable if no one is looking at the code for vulnerabilities and reporting them, and it's not being actively developed? So that was the case with this particular plugin. So the exploit is actually kind of really lame, actually. So you basically just pass it what's at the top there in the URL bar, and you use the PHP internal URL. What do they call that? It's called a PHP wrapper, right? Which is that internal mechanism in PHP to access resources. In this case, a resource is a file. Now, I thought that the best file to access through the server-side request forgery vulnerability was your wp-config.php. In most implementations of or installations of a PHP application, MediaWiki and or WordPress, your database credentials by default are typically stored in clear text inside of a file. In this case for WordPress, it's wp-config.php. So lo and behold, I can exercise this vulnerability to gain access to the wp-config, which gives me the database username and password, which is awesome, right? So like my internal scoring might be different depending on how I've protected this application. If this was a PHP application that Paul configured, you would not see a username and password. You would see references to an environment variable in which it reads that value for username and password from the environment, which means the attacker needs to have shell access in order to read the environment, not just access to the configuration file. I literally patted myself on the back when I realized I had configured our applications that way. So I was like, go me. Okay, so now we have database credentials, but what we really want is shell, right? So we know we can exercise that vulnerability. We've got some database credentials, but if I'm going to want to, let's say, break out of that Docker container and do other things on the system, such as maybe read environment variables if they were protected, I'm going to want shell. And this vulnerability is an arbitrary file upload vulnerability, not necessarily labeled as remote code execution. So again, I scanned the WordPress instance. I found this WP store cart vulnerability. Well, it listed that I had this plugin, right? The WP scanner didn't say I had any vulnerabilities with it. It just said, hey, you've got WP store cart. We believe it's version 2.5.29. because the README was left in the plugins directory. So this was kind of interesting. When I looked for CVEs that were specific to a vulnerability that was associated with WP Store Cart, when I went to the initial CVE page on the NVD database, there was no base score for 3.x. So I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. But if I clicked over to CVSS version 2.0, it did get a score, which it rated as 10.0, which is high. So you can see where this could be missed, right? My vuln scanner just said, hey, you got this plugin installed. CVSS version 3 doesn't have a base score. It hasn't been calculated for this vulnerability for whatever reason, probably because it's so old from 2012. But you had to click and go to the old score to get a 10.0 or higher listing for that CVSS score. So file upload is deceiving in and of its. I mean, even those other issues aside, right? Vuln scanner really didn't make any noise about it, just kind of identified it. The CVSS score was kind of obfuscated. You had to dig a little bit to get the proper score. And you may look at file upload, and with file upload vulnerabilities, it entirely depends on the application, right? Sure, I can upload a file. Can I access that file? Can I verify that my file has been uploaded? What types of files can I upload? Where can I upload files? All of those factor into the severity of this particular vulnerability. So what I did was I created the lamest PHP shell probably ever, right? It basically just takes a command and passes it to the command line. So I did that. Then I used the curl command to upload this shell.php to my web server. Very standard, very common. We're hacking like it's, probably 10 years ago, right? However, these vulnerabilities still exist in web applications today. So I upload my PHP shell to the web server, and now I have shell, right? Now I can access that vulnerability. I can exercise that vulnerability to upload a shell, and I can issue commands via that PHP shell that I uploaded. So very different from just thinking of a file upload vulnerability. This is really a remote command execution vulnerability if exercised properly and if conditions exist in my web application that allow the file to be uploaded to a place that allows the user to access that place, right? We may also, in different scenarios, get to this level, get to shell, because there are other vulnerabilities that we can chain together to make these conditions exist, right? In this case, I didn't have to do that. I was able to upload a PHP shell and run commands on the server. So now we have shell in addition to the database username and password. Okay, so the other vulnerability that I wanted to highlight here is the local file inclusion vulnerability, right? So these vulnerabilities can also be a little bit, kind of elusive. And so this particular widget is the IMDb widget. And it basically says, WP scan, when I scanned it, that this version is, in fact, out of date. The latest version of this plugin is 1.1.0. and installed on your installation is 1.0.8. So the vuln scanner didn't necessarily say that there was a local file inclusion vulnerability in this particular plugin, but it did note that it was out of date. And that's some of, I think, the nuances that we were discussing a little bit on the shows this week, and certainly amongst ourselves via our hosts, is that oftentimes when we look at and assess vulnerabilities of any type of application or system or network, that there may not be necessarily a published vulnerability, but we can look at the, let's say, web application and go, yeah, you're using some JavaScript libraries that are 5 years old, right? Now, there may not be published vulnerabilities associated with them, but you're using older software, is one thing we talked about in ESW yesterday, right? So this is pointing out that I'm using older software. So how bad is this vulnerability? It does have a local file inclusion. Again, we get the base score of 7.5 in our CVSS version 3. So, is 7.5 bad? 7.5 is to me is like average, right? Like, how would you make the determination as to how much risk this poses to your organization, what the impact of this is, if it's a 7.5? I've always kind of had an issue. Like, it's not, a medium is like halfway at 5.0, right? I mean, critical gets to 10.0, so this is like somewhere in between. How do I gauge the importance of this, particular upgrade to this WordPress plugin?
It's like when you're cooking, Paul, medium high heat, right? What's medium high heat?
Right, exactly. Exactly. Somewhere between medium and high, right? Which is exactly where we are with this. Now, there happens to be a vulnerability that was published in 2016. Oops. I think I just closed my browser window. Did I? Hang on. Let's get... What did I do? Just close the slides? Oops. Sorry about that. I will, if I can get these slides to come back up, show you the exploit for this. Yeah, so this one's kind of interesting. This is the exploit. This was on ExploitDB, and this vulnerable file includes a local file, right? So you can have a proof of concept. You can essentially go to the plugins, pick.php, and display the wp-config.php. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to actually treat it as an image file, right? So since I'm passing a parameter to pick.php, it's supposed to be displaying me an image. However, it accepts a parameter to include a local file. The local file I've told it to include is wp-config.php. So what you get as a result is the code goes, oh, I'm displaying the image. And by the way, I'm displaying the image you told me to display via a parameter. And here is that image. Now you can see this image, because I'm telling it to include a file and not an image, a text file and not an image, displays this little dot right here. And what you need to do, again, going back to the exploit description, is right-click on that, save image as, you'll get pic.jpg. You just append .txt to that, and lo and behold, pic.jpg.txt is not an image that was supposed to be displayed. It's the parameter you sent, which is your wp-config.php. So that's local file inclusion to basically get the same result of I can display the configuration and get the database username and password. So now I've got two vulnerabilities that let me read the configuration read files on the system, which I've gleaned from that some credentials, in this case to the database. I've also have shell on this particular WordPress system. So we're slowly accomplishing our mission. Now,
but wait, Paul,
go ahead,
remember, the two that gave you the configuration were 7.5s on the CVSS score. The
Correct.
other one was a 10 on the CVSS side. So you probably would have addressed the 10, but you may not have addressed the two 7.5s.
This is true. And with shell, of course, you could have displayed that information as well. right?
True.
You could have also missed that because, whatever scanner may not have dug into, a CVE from 2012 and an obscure WordPress plugin, right? Those kind of things happen as well. It could only be looking at the CVSS version 3 score, which was not scored for that remote shell vulnerability, right? But was scored for the CVSS version 2 score. So it depends on which score you're looking at in which vulnerability scanner or analysis that you're doing, which could have been missed.
Right.
So I now have access to the database, right? I actually don't, in this case, have to nmap scan to find it, because in the configuration, it tells you the IP address of the database server. So based on using those vulnerabilities to get the configuration, I can then now have shell access, use that to access the database server. And we find out that it's a Debian system that's running x86-64 based operating system and running a version of MySQL server that happens to be vulnerable to an attack that allows me to get shell. Now, my comment on this is you should go look at this exploit and work with it on your own. It's very involved to get this running. I think it's also kind of a shameless plug for Core Impact, right? Because they've done the work to make this work, so you can hand this off to a junior person. If you don't have a framework like that and you want to do this on your own, you have to compile some C code. You have to convert it to different formats. You have to load it as a plugin into the MySQL server. You have to change some configuration in MySQL to get it to execute that plugin. Then you can execute some SQL commands to run shell commands. I'll show an example of that. Then you can take it a step further and force basically MySQL to shovel a shell back to you, which is kind of like the advanced part of that pen test, right? I don't want to have to issue MySQL commands and SQL commands to access the shell. I just want a shell shoveled back to me so I can interact with it as I normally would. So this is an older exploit, but it checks out. A Star Wars reference there for you. And this takes advantage of the UDFs, user-defined functions that exist in MySQL. And you can see some of the examples there that show you how to compile it and get into different formats. And then you have to copy and paste this really long kind of binary thing, dump it into a file. In user-lib MySQL plugin udf.so. So it exists as a shared object that is then read in by MySQL. And you can see the function that I actually created was called doSystem, which is my function for executing shell commands. And I put together some SQL to execute my shell command, and I can see that I am in fact root. So now I not only have access to the database, all the files and databases, tables, records in the MySQL database, I also have a shell on the MySQL server as well, or the container in this case, in my mock environment that's running it. So now I have shell access on both containers for MySQL and WordPress. And the only thing left to do from here would be to jump out of that container and get on the host system. Now, there's a lot of ways that you can do this. I didn't list run C in here. That was another breakout vulnerability. There are other breakout vulnerabilities that I thought were really interesting. A lot of these vulnerabilities speak to the Linux capabilities that Docker containers use by default and the various mechanisms that ops teams and developers will use to either allow the container to have those capabilities or not. For example, if you run your container in privilege mode, -- privileged, I believe is the flag, that basically whitelists all of the capabilities. So you can be root on a Linux system, or you can be inside of a process that has access to a capability that doesn't require root user permissions, but the container has access to, let's just say sys module, which as a user lets me load and unload kernel modules. One of the examples is, as a user, if I have that capability, I can write a kernel module, which shovels me back a shell as root and load that into the kernel, and then my shell gets shoveled back to me. That I thought was the coolest one that I had seen in a while, which I thought was really awesome. And there's some other ways. Basically, the other method is taking advantage of another capability to gain shell, and that one happens to abuse file system access as well. So you can gain access to the root file system.
And this is why you don't run privileged containers.
Yeah, privilege is bad because privilege basically whitelists everything.
But there's a number of security solutions out there that run privileged containers to actually work, which is
because it gives
counterintuitive.
It basically gives them root level access to the system, right? Which is why they're doing that. I did want to give a big shout out to Pen Tester Academy. Some of the examples in the attack labs I gleaned from Pen Tester Academy and used their labs that are available on there, and they were just absolutely fantastic in letting me put together this story and having all of that set up, and they've done a great job. So if you haven't looked at the Pen Tester Academy attack labs, you definitely should, because they're awesome. Okay. Any questions up to this point?
Seems perfectly logical to me, Paul.
Awesome.
I'm glad you had to do the work, not me.
Fortunately, the attack labs made it a lot easier. I didn't have to set up a lot of the infrastructure on my own. I just had to put the the narrative together and research the CVEs. So, Bob, I believe you're up next.
Hey, thank you. Yes, I take that. We've got we aren't going to bore everybody with slides. We had a couple things we wanted to talk about, and then toss it into a really great demo.
My laptop doesn't like me today.
It doesn't. Yeah, you're having all kinds of troubles. Yeah.
Yeah, so we just wanted to have a quick shout out to all the other things that we do have over here at Core Security. I mean, Core Impact is a major piece of what we do, but we do have some other things around this with the more defensive side rather than the offensive side. Virus protection, threat hunting on the network, SIM solutions, and even policy managers looking for those bad configurations and the things you talked about. So kind of complementary to vuln scanners and some of those other things, as well as our own services team, that are out there doing these engagements as people require them. So quite a big portfolio that we work with. We're definitely focusing on Core Impact today, which is our pen testing platform, allowing people to be able to go out and exploit these kinds of vulnerabilities, validate the risk of the different things, like you said, not necessarily because it's a CVE 10, but because it gives us a hole to get in and start an attack path into the network. And we recently did a really big survey worldwide around penetration testing, how people are using it, why people are using it. And we didn't just talk to the pen test professionals and the red teamers, but we talked to the executive teams, the risk managers, the IT directors. And this is what they came back and told us about how they're using pen testing in their environments. Very much, towards that, how are we reducing the risk to our organizations? And the things they're most concerned about are, misconfigurations, still one of the biggest problem areas that we're seeing out there. Phishing, of course, it's gotten a lot worse now that we're all at home. Everybody's getting attacked with COVID this, COVID that, to go along with all the standard phishing vectors that we see. And still simply, and we see this a lot in security audits, we do just really poor password policies that allow us to easily crack and get in. Right close behind is our vulnerability management program support, and just overall measuring our security and compliance postures. And we do really like that vuln management support part of this. It gives us an easy way to go out and validate these things that the vuln scanners kicked out, like what you were just showing, and how risky really are these things. Is it super risky just because it scored a 10? Or is it super risky because it scored a 5 and I can use it to get in and now take advantage of the rest of the network? And we do have a lot of people that use us in these fashions. We even have some partners that help with the scoring based upon, impact in the exploits we have. If we've written an exploit for a certain vulnerability, that definitely raises their risk scores combined with CVSS and everything else as they look at these things across the network.
Bob, quick question on misconfigurations.
Yes.
In that, are vulnerabilities, like the base vulnerabilities and in the lack of a patch, included in that misconfiguration bucket? I'm just curious because we talk about misconfiguration a lot because we've seen a lot of breaches due to misconfiguration. Most people don't consider those traditional CVE vulnerabilities. So I'm curious how that bucket's defined.
We would agree with you on that, and that was how we asked those questions as well. I left a service open. I forgot to add a password control here. I didn't realize that my login prompt was exposed to the internet. And honestly, we sometimes even see Telnet open to the internet because people, well, my vendor said he needed some kind of access, so I gave him Telnet to the outside world. Or we're not looking at logging controls. I mean, we've seen servers come down because they got brute force attacked until they filled up their failed login log and it took the whole machine down. And that's how they figured out they were under an attack. So yeah, simple misconfigurations we still see as one of the biggest vectors people are using to get in and start to attack these customers.
And I like to use custom configurations and misconfigurations to find my own. And I provided an example of that. When we stand up a PHP application, for example, there shouldn't be clear text passwords in the configs, right? Should be reading from an environment to put a little extra barrier of protection in place, right? So if I found a PHP application in my environment that had clear text passwords, to me that would be a misconfiguration, right? So more advanced systems and solutions will allow you to customize what constitutes a misconfiguration and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think defense in depth is really important. What are all the barriers we can put in place to help protect our systems and just working our way down the pile, and adding everything.
Yeah, the vulnerability is kind of easy in some respects, right? Under that scenario, because the vulnerability exists. Misconfigurations, sometimes a little harder to go validate. And again, I think often missed in the ways certain systems are assessed.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm using an old version of SSH. Thing's going to kick out that I should patch it, but if I've also exposed that to the outside because of how I set my system up or permitted root login direct, I'm going to take that patch version and still make it really easy to get after.
Right.
So as we look at Core Impact, we really do think that it's a great tool to use to be working down these methods. We can easily replicating attacks and finding those gaps in the defenses. So not just that we could import a vuln scanner, from Tenable or from Saint or somebody else and turn around and pivot on those things, but actually going out and finding these issues as they exist in the environments and then easily retest. And we see a lot of people using it for that. So I may have identified my list, handed it off. The team has been working on remediations. Now I'm going to come back and just replay that same attack and see if they've actually solved the problems. Did they load the file up and now the DLL says it's there, but they never hit reboots? The DLL is not enforced and different things like that. Make sure that we have effective remediation scores out there and validate that. And just being able to test people and processes. So it's not just that I'm going out and hitting an operating system or a piece of network gear. I might be turning around and doing client-side attacks, doing phishing examples, either for training or as part of my engagement. It gives us a lot of flexibility on those different vectors and how we want to use those in our environments and in our side of our security programs.
Oh, it's demo time.
I think it's demo time. We'll turn it over to the good stuff and get out of PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm. James,
Yes.
You're up, my friend.
All right, let's see. Let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see your screen. It looks
Perfect.
familiar.
Awesome. All right, thanks. So so I've got a couple of different environments. I spun up my local. I've got some Vuln Hub boxes that I'll attack from time to time just to do some stuff. So when you showed the WP scan, that's actually how I was able to kind of get into this machine. And to kind of pivot off of what Bob was mentioning earlier is that, and I think you guys alluded to it as well, is that we can upload a scan and then start attacking the vulnerability. But when it comes to misconfiguration, sometimes you have to go and find where that's at. And so that's why I like trying to do some of these Vuln Hubs without using walkthrough guides, even though they're all available, to see if I can identify some of these as well. I will start with just, I've got an AWS environment here. So I'll just start with an upload since a lot of the people that we talk to that are getting into pen testing or starting to kind of back to the topic, address risk, they want to be able to say, hey, look, we're paying a lot for pen testers to come in, or we've got some pretty smart engineers. We want to be able to do this in-house. We're already scanning for vulnerabilities. So they wanted to be able to take that scan data, which Core can ingest here, and load that up from different scanners, whichever one you'd like, or just Nmap in itself, which Core has in the back end of its tool for its own scanning. But for this case, I just went and grabbed a Nessus scan that we ran on our AWS environment, which has a handful of machines. We had to migrate it from a different environment. But once I load that up, I can also tell Core, hey, do I want to look for services, banner grabs, zone transfers, all of that good stuff as well. So I'll set that to internal since I'm on the same network. And I'm just going to load up that scan. So this is where some of the automated features of Core comes in. It's going to immediately import that over, apply that, and then it's going to move down the list of how the RPT, which is what we call our rapid penetration test, it really gives users the ability to easily start kind of going through the different phases of a penetration test, right? Being able to say, hey, we've got scan data, which is vulnerabilities, which is risk. So can we start leveraging that scan data to show why patching is important, right? So not just, hey, we exploited that vulnerability, but also what are the downstream implications if we don't apply these patches, right? So whether it's a 7 or a 10 or what have you, Core is going to reach out and try to match those two things up. Now, as you can see, once I've imported that data, I'm still going to go through and do some scanning on my own. And I think you guys brought up a good point, which I kind of want to bring up as well, where, it could be version, it could be this, it could be that. You also want to see if there's a service running on there. Maybe we have a vulnerability or an exploit for that vulnerability, but it might be off like one digit or something, or it could be an older version or something. So you also want to identify the service that's running underneath so that you can move into step 2, which is attacking and penetrating these machines, right? So as you can see, it's loading up all of my machines. While it's doing that, I'm just going to give it a quick break, and I'll pop out to my local. That's all right. I don't want to confuse everyone. But I also did some web application scanning prior to this call, just so I could kind of set the table. Now, this isn't a VulnHub box. I do have a VulnHub box URL I can grab and put in here, but this is just Matilde, which is part of Metasploitable 2. So I use this to do some karate against. And I've got a couple of different URLs here that I want to attack. With Core, you can easily go to attack and penetration, and it'll just bring up all of the OWASP top 10. So let me show you where those are located. If I open up my exploits folder, you can see I've got several different OWASP top 10. You mentioned local remote file inclusion in your previous demo. I don't have those available in my target environment here, but we do have those available for Core. And you can see where they're highlighted. So that does mean that we could probably try it against some of these machines. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to focus mainly on a couple. So I'm going to focus on SQL injection. I'm going to focus on cross-site scripting. And hopefully, if I'm able to get some type of agent, which does give me a little bit of shell, but not quite enough, from there, I might be able to either harvest information out of the database, or from a cross-site scripting attack, maybe send that a malicious URL, so reflected cross-site scripting, to a user, and have that user click on the link, which I might be able to put keyloggers and things like that on it. So I'm just going to go to a couple of URLs, see if I identify really quickly what I've got on this. So this is DNS lookup. I put in some fake information earlier, so we're going to go with Facebook here. So I'm going to just drag this over. Cross-site scripting. And here's where I get to make my selections, right? What kind of browser do I want to use? Do I want to look for persistent cross-site scripting? Do I want to also test the different parameters for this attack? Once I hit go, down in the module log area is where you'll be able to see that interaction that Core is having against that application, right? So it's crawling these sites. It's going to be trying those different scripts inside those input fields to see if it can't get some type of response back from the application. And from there, it'll tell me which script maybe it ran and if it was successful, and give me a way to do some post-exploitation against that.
And James, what I really like about this particular strategy is if we're on a team internally, a red team for an organization, I can have my more junior members that don't have as much experience. I can give them this environment, right? I can give them the vulnerability scan results. I can give them core impact, and they can be effective. The more senior people can spend time digging into the ones that may be a little more esoteric, right? So I was doing a web app pen test this week, and it took me a few hours to determine that a vulnerability that was identified was not really a vulnerability, which required me to read JavaScript and jQuery and read about DOM-based cross-site scripting, review the JavaScript code that was in question, and determine basically that a user had to be logged in before that function was called, and the way it was being called was not in fact vulnerable, right? So now as the senior people can be looking at the things that require knowledge about 3 or 4 different technologies and the ability to read someone else's code and understand it, oh, by the way, this particular JavaScript code had swapped out all of its variable names for non-descriptive ones with A, B, C, D, E, and F to make it even more difficult to read, right? So that's what I want my more senior people to be working on, while the more junior folks can be immediately effective with the platform.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And so that's a really good audience for us, for some of the junior testers. It's that front line. They go grab the low-hanging fruit. They're able to do some reconnaissance in a way, right, to be able to go in and say, hey, we were able to identify all of these services that are running. We couldn't get in on anything, but there are some vulnerabilities possibly there, misconfigurations, right, not just vulnerabilities. And so they can kind of get that low-hanging fruit. The other benefit of having this do this for them is the fact that, some organizations have applications they test, but they don't want to always bring in some expert to do that. And sure, the expert will come in, have a lot more chances to be able to exploit against that from some of the other techniques. However, being able to give them these capabilities to do in-house until that person comes in is what we really try to do with Core as well.
James, there's a question from the audience. The question is, can you run multiple modules in a sequence? There's a couple of different ways to do that, right?
Yeah, sure. So there's actually a couple ways to do that. So if you noticed here, these modules are all run for information gathering. And just to kind of walk you through it, once I upload the data, it automatically starts scanning each of those IPs, right? So it's going to scan each of those. And this happens all at one time. To give you an idea of how that works from an attack standpoint, if I grab attack and penetration to my target environment, it's going to easily pre-fill those for me. Now, I could go to each individual one, and I could start looking to see from ports and services, what's running, and then say, okay, I see SMBs running on this. Maybe I start looking at an SMB attack for that. Maybe I come up to the top and type, hey, what does Core have for SMB? Wow, it lit up like a Christmas tree. So there's a lot for that particular host. But easier than going one by one and dragging those over, I can just pull this over here or to that particular machine, which actually I'll do, to that machine that has SMB. And now I'll just focus specifically on that machine. Or if it was a whole target environment, I could just have all of those be attacked. And now Core is going to ask me, what type of exploits or what type of attack do you want to do, right? Do you want to do code vulnerabilities? So looking, for any kind of think of Eternal Blue or something like that for SMB. Also, do you want to do brute forcing and dictionary attacks, right? So do you want to test some of the authentication weaknesses for that protocol? And then from here, I get to make additional selections. Do I want to deploy an agent, which is our payload, which think of like interpreter, right? Do I want to have some type of post-exploitation capabilities, which is really when you start defining the risk. And then how do I want to select this attack, right? What exploits criteria do I want to lead them by? When it comes to the identity attack, right, I want to focus in on SMB because I know that's on this machine. So I'm just going to stay here. I could throw everything else at it, and Core is actually smart enough be able to understand, hey, none of these other services are running, maybe RDP is running, so I'll attack that. But I don't want to, clog up my executed modules or anything if I know I'm focusing on SMB. And then from here, here's the different password options that we'll have, right? So we give you about 1,000 usernames and passwords. However, you can bring in your own dictionary. You can also bring in your own custom password list and username if you'd like. And what I think is really great, and I'll show you in a moment here, is if you're actually able to harvest passwords or credentials, hash values, what have you, maybe from Mimikatz, maybe from Security Account Manager. We have a couple modules that can do that type of stuff from your agent once we have them deployed. Then you can throw those back into the network. So let me just do a first pass with default credentials, and kind of going back to the conversation we had on misconfigurations. There's a lot of people that will spin up systems and just leave whatever the default password or default username is for that. So those sometimes are the low-hanging fruit that people are testing.
And then, James, the other audience question is, can you schedule that to run off hours? Is there scheduling? I don't remember, to be honest with you.
So there is, but not really. It's more around your scan data. Let me just address the first question because I kind of went on a tangent. My apologies on that. So as you can see here with the RPT, all of these things are happening at once, right? And it quickly identifies which ones are going through, which ones are working, which ones are not. I think I actually had this backwards, so I'm going to go back and try that again with just identity attack versus the exploits on this machine. Pop this here. And to answer the question around scheduling, we do have an option for that where you can schedule it, twice a week, once a week. It's actually on my dashboard screen, so I can pop back over there and kind of show you that.
Okay.
It really does take your scan data in. and then your scan data, we ingest that scan data in, however, often you have that run, and then you can have that automatically run on top of that, the exploits for that. And really, you can do that pretty quickly in what we call a one-step RPT, so you don't go through all of these steps to get there. Really, it's just, hey, grab that scan data, run this every Tuesday, every Thursday, what have you.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah, and then you can also customize sequence of the various modules by customizing your own macro, right? You can write your own macro.
Yeah, so we actually have a macro feature here, right? So if you don't really like the order that ours goes in from this area, you can set up a macro to pick your own selection. And what a lot of customers will do is they'll actually create data tags, right? So if I've got file servers, or if I've got web servers, and those file servers and web servers always seem to have the same vulnerabilities listed on them, then I want to be able to attack those without having to go through the same feature. So if I create a macro, and I'll just kind of pop out of here, try not to do too much clicking around. That's kind of the no-no in demo world. But you can see I've got some macros here, and I want to say for maybe code red, I've got a couple, just one. But what you could do is say, hey, I've got a macro that only uses exploits for my web servers, and I want to attack those very differently. Or maybe they're very sensitive, and I don't want to use a bunch of stuff banging against them all the time. Once I create that macro for that, I can just drag that over, and it'll run for that specifically. Now, you can't really schedule that, but it is something that if you come in every couple of weeks and you want to test your web servers for those vulnerabilities that you found, you can just pull that over, and it's going to run those specifically against that server tag, or you can create a group as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So you can see here that I was able to actually produce what we call an agent here at Core, right, which gives me multifunctional purposes or payloads, so to speak. And I'll just kind of show you what I did when how Core treated that, right? So you can see that we call it a verifier, which is an identity attack. And what Core does is it goes through each of these identities until it gets one correct. And when it does, it flips over to the module to install that. So this module is actually called Install an Agent Using SMB, but for non-core people, they refer to this as PSExec, right? So if I go in and if I can make that a little bit bigger, you can watch how Core goes through the process. Once it finds that SMB credential that was corrected, that username and password, it immediately shovels over to install an agent using SMB or PSExec. So it finds the admin share, it creates an executable, creates a service, throws in that executable, uploads it, and then tears it down, in which case I get remote code execution. And now that produces this agent for me. So this is when you start getting into the risk of not patching, right? Or the risk of weak passwords. Because once I have an agent in place, I can right click on this, let me slide that over. And very quickly, I have different commands that I can run. Now I have a whole folder of them over here. This is just more like hotkeys or buttons or something. But for instance, if I wanted to go into this machine and browse the file, since it loaded that in the admin share, I know where I'm at, but I could start kind of rummaging around. Maybe I want to download some information. Maybe I want to upload some information. Maybe I want to run PowerShell from here, so I can open up a PowerShell prompt from here. And one of the things, and you mentioned macro kind of came up as a question, you can actually create post-exploitation macros. So what I mean by that is as soon as an agent is deployed, you can have several post-exploitation, let me find the folder, macros run immediately. So screenshot is a really popular one, right?
Yep.
Hey, grab a screenshot, run Mimikatz, look into Security Account Manager. All of our agents reside in memory, so they're not persistent. Now you can make them persistent here. It's going to write it to disk. Most people keep them in memory for stealth or what have you. But by doing that, you know that you can grab some information very quickly. So for this case, I'm just going to run Mimikatz from here and see if I can't grab some Kerberos tickets, right? Some other information on the network. All of this stuff is now going to be shoveled over. I'm sorry to keep using the word shoveled. I saw it earlier on your slides, and maybe it's just stuck in my head. But now you can see that I've got some additional credentials outside of the one that I initially compromised, right? And if I go to Kerberos tickets, I've got some credentials here. We also give you the ability, if you have the right, like ticket granting ticket for an AD environment, we give you the ability to do gold and silver ticket attacks as well, or Kerberosting. But I'm going to take these known credentials that I just harvested from this machine, and I'm actually going to turn around and attack the domain controller, or at least that's what it looks like from the outset. But I'm not going to attack it with another attack versus exploits or vulnerabilities. I'm actually going to try to take those passwords and spray them back into that. Now, I don't have to throw them all back out there. I could just go in and grab one by one and try them. But this is kind of what I refer to as a spray and pray attack. where now I go in and try to throw those back at the same machine, because you never know. Maybe I don't get on machines without these credentials. Maybe now I got on a machine and I can get on there as root. So I'm just going to pick SMB again. And now I'm going to pick known identities, right? Because now I have validated identities that I've harvested from a previous attack. And I want to throw that back at this DC and see if I can't get on that DC from there. Here's just an FYI. We do have ways of controlling how much of the dictionary attack or attempts. But, if you're trying to be stealthy and not lock out somebody or not throw up a lot of red flags, you can control that. And I don't know, just let me know if there's any stuff in the chat. I'll be glad to answer it. Steamroll here.
There is a question about prices and pricing. I guess we can cover that at the end, how it's packaged and priced.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
And what I like is that, that's a very common Active Directory attack, right? To compromise one system, harvest credentials from it, obviously, and then use those credentials to gain access to the domain controller and or domain admin accounts. And what's nice about Core Impact is, you can blow through that really, really fast and easy just by pointing and clicking around, right?
Yeah, it really is. And you can kind of just stay in these top three realms over and over, right? So I haven't really covered, I've covered the individual modules under local information gathering, but if I just stay 1, 2, 3, right? And if I just open this up, connect all agents, right? So I'll go next. And these are all categories. And within each of these categories is very, specific techniques. And once I hit finish, you'll see all of them pop up. But the one I'm really interested in at this point is network routes, right? I want to really see if there's additional network routes, because one of the most powerful things that Core has and is known for is it's easily being able to pivot around, right? Pivot from one machine to another, pivot from one network to another, utilizing information. So if I have a machine that has 2 interfaces on it and that other interface is talking to a back-end, engineering or back-end database location or something else, or maybe I'm on a web server and I'm in the DMZ and I want to see if I can get into the back end somehow. So you can see here, it runs network routes, right? And if I go in and kind of see, now I have at least 2 interfaces. And right now I'm on the 1, 2, 3 network, right? So if I'm on this network and I try to scan this 220 network, I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to kind of come up lame. As you can see, though, it found an additional host here based off of everything. But what I'm going to do is right click. I'm going to set this as source. So now I'm attacking from this agent. I'm attacking from the DC. I don't know if I have enough time, but usually I'll pop open Wireshark so people can see that, it's going to be the DC that's going to be doing that.
Yeah,
but
so basically you've made that agent proxy all of the traffic from Core Impact to attack that other network.
So I'm controlling from this agent, and now I'm going to attack, or actually what I'm going to do is actually scan that new network that I know exists from the DC. So if I pop over here, 220, I'm going to do the whole subnet and see what I can find. Here's just different ways of scanning the environment. I'm just going to go with detailed. It just throws a lot more modules at it. And, because Core has a lot of functionality around, filtering and stuff, I'm just going to filter out everything. I'm going to stop this, right click, kill that process, and then I'm going to go and see what's going on with this machine real quick. This should probably open up some additional routes for me to be able to kind of move over to. And that's how you can easily start kind of pivoting around different parts of the network. You can use this capability of pivoting to create jump boxes, right? So if you have a remote location or something like that, and you want to see if there's additional, if you want to, put this agent on a machine by SSH, which I have an AWS environment. This is our AWS, but I have Core Impact at home. So I'll put an agent on a Linux machine in SSH, and then I'll pivot off of that AWS machine, either to scan my AWS environment or to scan away from that. Gives me the opportunity to scan my external perimeter right here at my house, or maybe I have a web application I want to hit from the outside, stuff like that.
And James, just from a user perspective, I've found that pivoting and proxying not only to be flexible, but super reliable. A lot of other tools and frameworks, when you start using them to scan through, right, may have limitations. What I've always found about the Core Impact agent and its capabilities to basically proxy my scans and exploits is super reliable.
Oh yeah, totally. And so we have some people that'll make these persistent so they can always kind of go back to them very quickly. They don't have to keep redeploying them. You can actually set up an expiration date on your agents. So that, if you want them to die off or kill them off at a certain time, you can do that kind of stuff as well. But this is what a lot of people really like to utilize, especially in this environment where we're at now, where a lot of people are having to work remote. Maybe they don't want to ship their box off to a remote location and have someone plug it in that has Core Impact installed on it. Maybe they'll just poke a hole somewhere and put a machine or put an agent on a machine, via SSH, which we have all of these different ways of actually doing that. So if I go to a Linux machine here, you can see that it'll pop open SSH, and then I could pull that over and then say, well, I know the username, password, or maybe I have the private key, and maybe I want to have admin rights, stuff like that. So real easy way to deploy it if you know the credentials outside of just exploiting against vulnerabilities, right? Sometimes people want to create different vantage points inside their network. Hey, if an attacker was at this part of the network, what could they do? Or, hey, let's see if we can get past our cardholder data segmentation that you guys were talking about before. But, this is a way to be able to test that, get inside of that environment, and then scan that environment from the outside. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to kind of go over the web stuff on the back end. Maybe we can do that for another time if you'd like. But there's a lot of risk capabilities that you can do from that end around looking at database logins, database schemas. If you're able to kind of get SQL agents in place, you can start harvest stuff from that. So just a ton of capabilities with Core. And what we try to do when we talk to prospects or customers is really kind of understand what is it they're trying to achieve and see if we can't tailor, either demos or, some proof of concepts or even just the tool itself.
Yeah. So James, my example of I can log into the database server and then I'm going to exploit it and get shell, that capability, rather than me compiling the exploits and going through all of those steps, those capabilities are built into Core Impact. Whereas if I have, let's say, a MySQL set of credentials, I can use that to try to deploy an agent and gain shell, correct?
Yeah, correct. So once you have, and I don't know why, demo gods, right? Once you have access to like a SQL agent, we actually give you a couple different capabilities. So I'll just kind of assume that I have a SQL agent for some reason. I don't, but you can look at the schema, right, which is very helpful because the other thing you can do is a SQL shell. So you can say, hey, give me a SQL shell. Right. Well, it's not really good if you don't know the schema. You can try asterisk or some all-encompassing stuff. But this way, you'll be able to say, hey, I want that table. I want that field from that table harvested out. And the other things you can also do is really move from the web application side to the network side, right? We call these OS agents on the network side. So if you think about a SQL agent, it's going to be able to drop that payload onto the database, and that database ultimately will be able to, if it's on the server, now you're on the server on the network side, and now you have a foothold in the network.
Yeah, so it's letting me pivot to just accessing the database to basically having command execution on the host that's running that database service.
Exactly, and that's where, if you get on the right web server in the DMZ, then you would do the same thing I showed you on this side, where you just set a source, and then you start scanning and going from there.
Mm-hmm. So James, in Paul's example, right, he used WP scan, pulled some scan results. Mm-hmm. And then he went through a series of manual validation steps to, get the login credentials, et cetera. I'm assuming a lot of that's automated right here with Core, right? I pull down the scan results. It looks at all the vulnerabilities. You're doing some initial additional analysis, and now a whole series of modules are going to start to run. You're going to automate all the things Paul pretty much did last week, right?
Yes, you will. And that's, I think that's really helpful for people that are just getting into it. I kind of make the joke from time to time. It's like Mike Tyson's comment, right? Everybody has a strategy until you get punched in the mouth. Mm-hmm. So it's like, hey, you can run the RPTs, you can do all this, and it'll grab a lot of good stuff, and it'll automate a lot of good features. But sometimes you're going to get stuck by something. So you got to have a way to maneuver around that compensating control, or, hey, they didn't give me the vulnerabilities, weren't as vulnerable as I thought, or patching or what have you. So you can look for actual misconfigurations. One of the things I did in this Vuln Hub that I was working through is, and I'll save you the steps on how I got here, but I actually did a WP scan through a Linux subsystem that I put on my Windows machine. And from here, you have, I guess, the admin credentials correctly. So this gave me access to this file as an admin. And so what I was going through is trying to find a way that I could put some type of web shell on this machine. Ultimately, I came down to the header information, where I was able to go out and I grabbed this from an older test monkey, which is still very popular, and I just put in a web shell, right? And I had it point back to my Core Impact license. and back to the port that I wanted. And so what I would do is create a way to catch that using Netcat. We call it Php Shell, and we have a couple. Well, we have a couple ones for Windows as well. But this is a way that you can start kind of trying to catch shells coming back from applications that might be vulnerable. So once I set this up, and I haven't done this in a couple weeks, so hopefully doesn't make me look foolish now. I'm just going to go to that site again. Let's see. Secret. Try to run that and then see if on the back end, so you can see it caught that shell, right? And then you can see how it dropped a file in the temp folder, and then from there uploaded that, and it gives me shell on that. So in this case, I'm taking a misconfiguration on an application, not really a vulnerability, right? Not something that I'm scanning for. And I'm actually utilizing other tools within core to catch shells from stuff that I had to put in manually. So there's a lot of
James, did it deploy an agent from your web shell?
Correct. That's it right here. So if I go back down to the bottom.
So now you have a full core. You don't just have that web shell capability. Using that web shell agent. Core can deploy the agent using that shell.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly. So that's what I'm saying is I'm installing an agent, and if I go to this, it'll tell you this is basically a Netcat mechanism, right? So you can see here, right? If I wanted to do a regular Netcat bin shell, it'll pop back over and I can catch it. But from here, that agent or that configuration that I put right here, right? That is what I used. And then I just went to that machine or went to that URL, ran it like a user would. So this is persistent. Think about it. If this is always on there and nobody catches it, I can get this shell pretty much anytime I want to until they take that off of that page. So that's what I'm saying. Not everything's always going to be an RPT or an automated stuff. There's a lot of power under the hood of Core Impact. You just kind of have to know where to go.
Just two questions that I think you can hit quick. One, are there any plans to integrate with Cobalt Strike, and what are those? And then a little information about pricing and packaging for Core Impact.
Yeah, I'll let Bob. Bob, you can take.
I can take those.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we are definitely in talks with Cobalt Strike and Raphael about how we want to bring these two solutions together and make them more seamless. We are really good at having professional exploit writers running a lot of exploits. He's got some great beacon technology similar to our agents, but it has capabilities that are unique to that platform. So as we're looking to integrate these things together, like we're showing here, dropping an agent, we'd like to maybe someday just sideload a beacon and pull the two pieces together, or get access to the exploits from Impact and use those to do the initial penetration of the system, and then turn around and let the beacons take hold and run Cobalt Strike on the backside. So we're definitely working down those paths. It's still in planning. No big changes to announce yet, but we are heading in that direction most certainly now that they're part of our HelpSystems family. Pricing wise, there are different options depending on the type of system that you're looking to do. Perpetual subscription, of course, how you want to purchase. Basically looking at per user type basis. So how many users do I want to have? Those users, of course, can load Impact on multiple systems, much like James is doing, or I might do. I might have a VM for certain things, a laptop for certain things.
So it doesn't have to be licensed per machine. It can be licensed per user, and that user can install it on as many machines as they like.
Yes.
Gotcha.
So I've got my laptop, I might break something laptop, and then I got my VMs when I want to just play with things in the cloud. I can just use the same copy for all of that. We do occasionally have people that need bursting capability. We support that as well. So maybe they've got a few copies of Impact for their day-to-day work, but some new bigger job comes on. I need to step up a few extra guys using the product for a quarter while I go out and do this engagement. And we support those types of activities as well.
Yeah, I think the context for the initial question was a pen tester, right? Like maybe an independent pen tester, they wanted to use the product as part of their services work, I think was one of the initial contexts for pricing.
We have quite a few people doing that. They are using Impact as part of their engagements when they go out and do services, either all the time or in that bursty mode if they have to add on people. That's a pretty common use case for us. James alluded to it a little bit. We do have people that even do this as a jump box. So they forward deploy a jump box, go out there and then use that, especially in today's world where we're all working from home. And then that copy of Impact actually is set up to work for that certain place. Tear it down, throw it away, build a new one for the next guy, and send that out again.
Sweet. I know we're a couple of minutes over. I believe we answered all of the questions that I can see. So wanted to thank everyone for participating in the webcast today, and thank everyone for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.